Howdy, folks. We're not getting started just yet. We're still a few minutes out. I just wanted to do a couple of quick things. Before we get started, we're about 4 minutes from the start. So I know we've got Sam on. If you don't mind, Sam, we'll do a quick audio check. If you're hearing me, 1, 2, 3. And if Jamie wouldn't mind, please giving us a quick sound check.
Sure. 1, 2, 3, check.
Thank you. And thank you, Sam. All right, as I mentioned, folks, we'll get things kicked off in a couple of minutes here. We'll do a couple of pre-webinar announcements in just a moment. I appreciate everybody who's joined early. Thank you for that. Sit tight, grab a cup of coffee if now's a good time, and we'll be back on in just a moment. Again, for the folks who just joined, your audio is working fine. We just haven't kicked things off yet. We are about 2 minutes out. We'll do a couple quick announcements in just a moment, and then we'll get things kicked off. Thanks again for your patience, and we'll be right back on. All right, we'll go ahead and get a few things started here from an announcement standpoint. A couple of quick things before we get the live session kicked off. I want to thank everybody for joining us for today's exciting webinar. Great topic today, navigating the impact of new EU regulations, presented to you by Asterix. And before we get into today's session, we go to the next slide. Just want to take a moment and introduce you to who Asterix is as a company. If you haven't been on any of our webinars in the past, we'd certainly love to introduce ourselves. And then I'll turn it over to our great speaker for today in just a moment. So company snapshot-wise, who we are, some fast facts. We were established in 1995. You can just scooch back to that slide real quick, Jamie, if you don't mind. We were established in 1995. What vendor and platform agnostic means is we are a consulting firm that works with a wide array of different technologies in the marketplace. We don't align ourselves with any one technology. Typically the work that we do with our customers is try to help them put the best solutions in place based on what we know about their business and what we learn about their business. We operate from locations in the United States as well as overseas and have over 2,000 employees. One thing we're proud of is 90% or more of our team members hold advanced science degrees. We are a science-based company that provides support to science-based companies. And our headquarters are in beautiful Red Bank, New Jersey. The type of companies we help are startups to Fortune 1000. We're typically dealing with life science enterprises, chemical, CPG, government agencies, research institutions, typically anybody with an R&D department or a laboratory. And we can go to the next slide. So in terms of the services I mentioned, we're a consulting services firm. What are those services that we provide? We provide an end-to-end service offering. We like to say helps accelerate digital transformation and optimize performance across your ecosystem. This could be everything from in the beginning stages when we begin working with companies at more at the strategic level. We do things like strategic innovation, enterprise architecture. These are oftentimes, if I could summarize them quickly, obviously you can read the bullet points, but if I could summarize them quickly, it's really helping companies understand, what their technology roadmap should look like, how to get there, how to move away from current systems to a full digital transformation. And then, solution selection, what are the tools and technologies that you're going to need to accomplish those goals? We help with everything from RFP development through, helping you do scoring analytics and vendor reference checking, right? So we get into the weeds with those type of things. Development and implementation, we can help with things like system configuration, customization, training, and documentation. Finally, when a system is implemented or a series of systems are implemented, we can help with computer systems validation, making sure that obviously they are up to snuff with what the FDA requires. Then ongoing application support. We can help you support that application or entire technology architecture for you. And we can even at the end help staff it. We can either staff IT professionals or we can staff your laboratory directly. So that's a little bit about Asterix, a little bit about the services we provide. You can certainly take a look at us online and learn more about those. Let's switch gears and take a moment to introduce our speaker for today. And I'll sit back and enjoy the presentation with you. Jamie O'Keefe is the head of our clinical and regulatory consulting division here at Asterix. He leads the clinical and regulatory practice. He brings over 18 years of R&D management and IT consulting expertise, working with both top-tier pharmaceutical firms and early-stage biotechs. Very, very pleased to be working with Jamie again and hearing his presentations, which are always very, very compelling. I'll obviously turn it over to Jamie at this point, let him finish his introduction, and I'm going to sit back and enjoy the presentation.
Great, thanks a lot. Thanks everybody for joining this afternoon. As an overview, as you all have signed up for, we're going to talk today about the recent EU clinical trial regulation that's been put in place, as well as with that, the clinical trial information system that really has kind of transformed the landscape and how you now manage content and manage submissions and applications, both from an eTMF perspective, but also from your regulatory information management perspective. So there are some challenges and complexities that may come to that depending on the size of the organization. So we're here to kind of give an overview of the new EU-CTR, as well as some of the impacts to eTMF and RIM, as well as just overall process and organizational impacts. So starting right from the top, kind of a high-level intent and purpose of the new CTR. The intent of this really was to improve the patient safety and enhance transparency of information by putting forth a single set of regulations across the European Union and the European Economic Area. So the previous directive that was in place was a guideline that then had to be legislated at a country-by-country level about how all of the directives were put into place, which made for a bit of a fractured scenario. So the whole point here is it's intended to simplify that regulatory model and to reduce the administrative burden overall with a more streamlined approach. So the clinical trial regulation went live on the 31st of January in 2022, and that started a 3-year transition period that will take us from the clinical trial directive that started in 2004 over to fully supported by 2025 onto the EU-CTR. So current state today, we're working in a mixed model, dual model approach here, where current studies and current applications can be managed and submitted under the directive as well as under the regulation. One of the big areas, and probably the biggest from a simplification standpoint, that has changed with the directive is what's called coordinated assessments. So now there's a single authorization procedure across all of the EU and EEA, regardless of whether you're submitting and applying for a single nation or across multiple nations. So instead of having multiple applications, one for each country, there's a single application process. There's also a single entry point for the application and the authorization and supporting documentation, which is the CTIS system. As I said, that now supports a single set of documents that gets submitted across the multiple member states if it happens to be multinational. And all of the activities in the application are coordinated by a reporting member state for the life of the application. So there's a lead member state that the sponsor can work with, as opposed to individual member states as it is today. And the final major change for this is there's a single national decision and authorization per member state. So it's not having multiple queries and responses within the member state for the different authorities. Another big change is, as I spoke of, the CTIS. So the Clinical Trials Information System now supports the flow of information between multiple stakeholders. So the clinical trial sponsors themselves, the European Union, EU, member states, the European Economic Area, which is EEA, as well as the European Commissions. And it supports interactions between the sponsors, the regulatory authorities, in the member states and countries throughout the life cycle of the clinical trial. So this is now the primary conduit of all communication and submission information. And one other big component of this is the CTIS is open to anyone. So there are what are called workspaces. There are member state workspaces, there's the sponsor workspace, and then there's also the public's workspace. So there is information available to the public, open via a publicly searchable website. And the clinical trial sponsors can use the CTIS to apply for authorization to run a trial into up to 30 member countries via one single online application. As I briefly talked about before, there's significantly increased transparency here via the public workspaces. So all data and documentation submitted through the CTIS will at some point in time be made available for all of those authorized or refused studies in a standardized timeline. Some exceptions can and will be made for personal data, commercially confidential data, confidential communications between the member states are held out. As far as the timelines, so for category 1, applications phase 1, 7 years after the study, it will be made available. For phase 2 and phase 3 studies, which is category 2, it will be at 5 years. And for category 3, which is phase 4 and low interventionals, they will be provided and released in 1 year. Some of the available information that can be accessed at that point will be the application form, the protocol, the investigator brochure, names of the investigators and their CVs, the clinical trial sites that were leveraged, summary of the clinical trial results, the final assessment reports, and the final inspection reports if applicable. Another big change and big implication of the CTR is in regards to response timelines. So with all of the centralized and streamlined approach, sponsors now must reply to any application queries or requests for information from any of the member states within 12 days. And if you do not reply within that time period, the application will lapse and then will require a reapplication or resubmission of the application. With the streamlined approach, this now counts for all member countries. So if you don't respond in the time frame to one member country, it removes the application across all of those that are in your portfolio. Authorizations will expire automatically via CTIS if no patients are recruited within 2 years of the authorization. Serious breaches are required to be reported within 7 days. And another key timeline that has been set is archiving of the trial master file is now set at after 25 years of close of study. Informed consent has a significant change. So it has expanded and detailed out guidelines for informed consents across such areas as broad consents, simplifying the consent for cluster trials, a change from the consent for minors or incapacitated people, as well as consent for pregnant or breastfeeding women, other vulnerable populations, and during trials and emergency settings. There's also been a fairly significant update to the definition of a legally designated representative to be able to sign informed consents. So it is now stated as a natural or legal person, authority, or body, which according to member state law is empowered to give informed consent on behalf of the subject who is either incapacitated or a minor. From a timeline standpoint, there's a pretty structured timeline that's been outlined for both the CTR and the CTIS. As I said, the 3-year transition period started on the 31st of January 2022, so we're a little over 18 months into it. So within the first year of that, the sponsors were able to submit clinical trials under either the directive or under the CTR. Starting the 31st of this year, all new clinical trial applications are subject to the CTR. But those that were already approved under the directive prior to the 31st of January they can continue to be regulated under the clinical trial directive until the end of the transition period in January of 2025. Then as of the 31st of January 2025, all trials, regardless of in-flight or to-be or applications, must be regulated under the clinical trial regulation. So at a high level, some impacts of the new regulations on processes and responsibilities within sponsors. There's a significant impact to study startup due to the fact of having a single CTA across all of the EU and EEA member countries. There's a much stricter requirement around selection and addition of countries that had not been the case previously when you could just submit supplemental applications per country. A big area that needs to be determined from a sponsor perspective is who's responsible for CTIS submissions and management. So what organization and person within the department is going to be responsible for the collection of and then submission on an ongoing basis of the documentation and data into the CTIS system, as well as there's a fairly robust amount of work required for user access management within CTIS across the sponsor organization. It's going to be really important to ensure that processes and SMEs are in place and available to respond to the RFIs and queries, given the 12-day timeline. That's a pretty tight turnaround. And there's a pretty strong impact from the transparency standpoint and the redaction requirements. So there are requirements to have parallel copies of documents that are redacted for personal information or corporate security information and things like that. Increases the work overall from a submission standpoint, but also ensuring that you have the appropriate securities in place. And across all of that, it's going to be critical to define the operating model across all of your departments, from clinical operations and clinical development and startup on through into regulatory, with very clear roles and responsibilities outlined to ensure that you have a quality first submission of content as well as response times across the entire CTA process. So going on to what's the impact on the eTMF, there are quite a few new documents that are proposed or spoken of within the clinical trial regulation that are going to need to be stored in the trial master file. So there'll be some impact and some assessment required to look at are there needs to create new sub-artifacts or new classifications within your eTMF, or is there a place where you can map to existing sub-artifacts that exist? As I talked about a little bit earlier, the archiving is a significant change in clarification. So it'll be important to update your SOPs and your processes in order to ensure that you're maintaining retention for 25 years from end of the clinical trial. There's an interesting change in the language from a TMF perspective. It is referenced several times throughout the regulation of a trial master file in singular fashion, as opposed to previously it was spoken about trial master file content or trial master files. There is a single reference within here about the notion of a separation between the sponsor's trial master file and the investigator master file. But it is interesting it will be interesting to see the impact of that change if the EU is really considering that there needs to be a single active trial master file, or if they're more talking about from the standpoint of a comprehensive management of it via a trial master file plan. There's a notion within the CTR of co-sponsorship of a study across multiple sponsors. This could have a significant impact on your eTMF if it's something that you move forward with as an organization. It will have an impact on security potentially of your TMF, how your TMF is managed, the TMF plans, as well as just the organization and your expected documents, given the responsibility of each sponsor within the co-sponsorship construct. There was a notion of a low interventional study, which is a new definition within the CTR. And it specifically calls out less stringent requirements for the contents of the trial master file and driven off of a risk-based approach. So there'll be some impact from expected documents perspective and overall TMF index for those kinds of studies should you implement low interventional studies. And the biggest change potentially is the repository for dossiers. Since the CTR drives more of a rolling submission process for the application, it's going to be important to understand and have a consolidated repository that will feed the CTIS over time. And it's going to need to be decided within each organization. Is that going to be your eTMF? Is that going to be your RIM system? It's less clear than it was before when there was more of a monolithic dossier submission, where it made the most sense for it to come from a RIM system. Similarly, from an impact on the RIM side, obviously the repository question is the same. So making a decision on where the CTIS submissions are going to be sourced from. There's an impact of potentially going towards centralized CTA management, and how will those evolving processes affect your RIM configuration, your workflows, your security, and even your associations within your planning and tracking capabilities. There's potentially a change in how you would source and track and respond back to the RFIs. Obviously, the correspondence capabilities can handle it because at the end of the day, an RFI is just correspondence, but tracking the timelines and the responsibilities is going to be important to do that more tightly than it has in the past. So there may be some systems impact to that. And then changes to how your RIM is set up to handle a single application at this point across managing the reporting member state as well as the associated concern member state. And then finally, just some implementation considerations. So across your organization, as I said, it's going to be critical to understand the impact of this and appropriately address it in order to embrace the EU-CTR. So we recommend strongly that you do an impact analysis. So how do these new requirements and timelines and regulations affect your current processes, your current operating model, even things like whether or not you outsource certain components that are dependent for the EU-CTR and CTIS submissions. As I said, defining the roles and responsibilities and processes across the departments is going to be critically important in order to ensure quality and consistency and not having applications consistently rejected and starting over. And then based off of those, putting in place those system enhancements to track the compliance to the regulations, as well as account for the new requirements and new document types and things like that. So we all know system changes typically take longer to get in place, so it's good to get ahead of that and plan for those as early as possible. And then with all of those, in order to maintain your compliance, it'll be important to update your standard operating procedures, build your work instructions out, and provide training necessary, both on the changes to your internal systems and processes, but also training for CTIS for those that will interact with that system. And then probably the most important part of all of this is to monitor the compliance and effectiveness of all this and really put in a robust ongoing change management and metrics program to ensure that your organization is appropriately driving the new processes in place. And with that, I'll open up the floor to any questions that may have come in.
Great, thank you very much, Jamie. Some excellent information in there. Bear with me 1 second here. What we typically do is we'll stop the recording during the Q&A session.